Well, we have been talking about, just a brief reminder, I know there are nuances with these words, but I'm using the words worldview, ideology, belief system, religion, and story kind of interchangeably. And I want you to think about them all having a same thread, and that is all of those things are beliefs with which we make sense of our world. At its most basic, that's what an ideology is how we make sense of our world. We make sense of the things that are happening to us. We try to answer most ideologies, most religions, worldviews typically try to answer the big questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And what are we doing? And so all of these, I wanted to take a look at some of the major religions, the major worldviews that are affecting our lives in the 21st century and world events. So let me recap what we've talked about in the first couple of lessons. First, we talked about the Christian story. And when I say story, I don't mean something that's not true. This is a true story. That's my view, and I'm open to discuss that with anybody. I believe this makes the best sense from a rational point of view. Speaking rationally, I believe this story makes the most sense of human history, human purpose, and the world in which we live. I believe it conforms best to the reality of the world in which we live. So when I say story, I mean something that could be true, something that could be mythical, and some of these stories are not true. And yet, we cling to a story, a belief system, a worldview, a religion, an ideology to make sense of our world. Well, here's the basic Christian story. God created us in His image, so we are unique and valuable as individuals. This is baked in to the essence of the biblical story. We rebelled against God, that's called sin, and broke our relationship with Him and with each other, that's called fallen humanity. We need reconciliation with God to be whole. Because He loves us, God reconciled us through Jesus the Christ on the cross. That is the gospel story. Our old self is dead, and we live as new people in surrender and obedience to Christ. This speaks to identity. In other words, who are we? We were rebellious sinners. We are followers of Jesus Christ. It's a change of identity. The New Testament talks about it in terms of transformation. I mean, there's much language around this as you read your New Testament. It talks about you've been transferred from death to life. You have been transformed into the image of Christ. Your old self has been crucified and you are raised to walk in newness of life. Christianity is not an ethical system per se. Jesus didn't come to make better people. He came to make brand new people. This is very different than most other ideologies or religions. Christianity is not about making better people. It's about making new people. And God is the author, last part of the story, of truth and justice, right and wrong. So Christians believe that there is an absolute standard, such a thing as absolute truth. We actually believe there is such a thing as justice, meaning not situational justice, but there is such a thing as things that are just at all times and for all people. And then we believe in right and wrong, good and evil, because of who God is and who we are. I mentioned some of these things because some of the stories you're going to see don't believe about this at all. So the next story we talked about was, and I'll have to just really summarize it, but we spent 2 lessons on modern secular story, the modern secular ideology. When I talked about Islam and Judaism and Christianity about 5 years ago, the modern secular story was secular humanism, and it has a lot of flavors, and it's basically not religious in the sense of believing in God. It's all about believing in yourself, but it is coalesced into a very, very religious system. I mean, you have the priests of the modern secular story. You have sin. Unfortunately, you have no forgiveness, but you do have sin. It's an ugly little religion, but I mean, you've got sin, but you got no forgiveness. And I say that from the point of view is you can never get right. in this particular religion. But it's coalesced into something that is a worldview that is very definable. And its roots are in social and cultural Marxist ideology. That's just, we trace that so you can understand why people who live out this story say what they say and think the way they think. And I think it's important for us as Christians to listen to other people and understand how they think. Whether we agree or disagree, it's nice to know, where are you coming from? Well, here's the modern secular story. We each belong to intersecting groups of oppressors or oppressed, and our identity is found in our group. This basic idea, obviously, you can just immediately see how very different this is from the Christian story. It's going to be different from the Muslim story, and it's going to be different from the Jewish story as well. All of these ideologies are going to have places where they clash, where they do not agree, they do not see the world the same way. Identity in this story is found in your group, not as an individual. Your identity is your group, and it is the story of groups battling one another. It is the inevitable story of the Darwinian story, or the Nietzschean will to power, or the Marxist class warfare. It sees conflict between the groups as inevitable and necessary. We must revolt against and overthrow the oppressive classes, or the oppressive groups. So this, baked into this story, is group identity and conflict. Conflict is inevitable. I think I quoted for you Malcolm X, and read a lot of his work, and he's just a brilliant prophet, if you will, for this story. And his point is that freedom never came peacefully. And that's as Marxist an idea as you can get. And so it's very true to this story, is that there is inevitable conflict. Revolt is the only way. And truth claims, so this gets into language, into speaking, and this is why communication is so difficult. Truth claims are instruments of oppression. And what that means is, when I say, let me tell you my story, this point of view says, that's you trying to oppress me. And justice in this story is whatever serves the group. And morality serves the interest of the group. There is no absolute truth or justice or right and wrong. It depends on the class or the group in which you exist. You may like what I'm saying or not like what I'm saying. Here's my challenge. Listen to the news and watch current events and see, you will see this story behind those events, many events that are happening. And that's my purpose, is I want us to understand, instead of being angry, saying, I think I understand the story, the ideology, the religion, the worldview behind these events. If you just listen to this, watch events in the world, and it will make a lot of sense, okay? That's a nutshell. Our last two lessons were on this story, so I'm not doing it justice, but that's the basic modern secular story. So let me pause before we jump into the Moses story, the Jewish story, and see what questions we have on this.
Would you say that Marx and Darwin had knowledge without wisdom? Sounds like the worst parts of Ecclesiastes.
Well, that's an interesting question. That's an opinion question. So I want to be careful to differentiate what I'm going to claim is factual, which I realize that's an oppressive truth claim I just uttered there. But in all seriousness, there are certain things that are widely accepted and established. This is an opinion. Would I say that they had knowledge without wisdom? I really haven't thought about it from that perspective. But yes, in this sense, and you're wise to bring up Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes fundamentally, if you don't know what this book is, don't worry about it. Nobody's born knowing it. I didn't grow up in church either. When you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it is Solomon, so you're writing in the 10th century BC, so say 3,000 years ago. And he's got everything in the world he could have, and he writes this book, and basically the thesis of this book is meaningless, everything is meaningless, okay? Sounds depressing, but he isn't really trying to be depressing. Nietzsche Darwin would have said exactly the same thing. The book of Ecclesiastes is the best description I've ever heard of life outside the Christian story. Life in fallen humanity. Nothing is new, nothing ever satisfied, there's nothing new under the sun, and in the end, it's all just chasing after the wind. So yes, in that sense, I would say it's a very Ecclesiastes way of looking at the world from a purely perspective of nothing beyond what you can see and trying to explain the adversarial forces that got us here. It is a very Ecclesiastes kind of a story. That's a great point.
Do the Scandinavian socialist countries show that Marxism can be a success?
Good question. Let's talk about Scandinavia. We talked about, I didn't put this in the story, but Marxism has a social or cultural version. I just gave you that story. But there's also an economic version, it's exactly the same. But the economic version of Marxism basically falls into two pieces. We talked about socialism and communism. Marx saw socialism as a step to the utopia of communism. Socialism, I'll be really brief here. Listen to the last lesson just to get more. I don't want to bore you. Socialism is basically, there are a lot of flavors of it, but basically government ownership of all of the means of production. Now, there are a lot of flavors, but basically you would take things like, well, for example, Sweden owns the state oil company. So in socialist countries, the government owns the factories, it owns the industries, it owns Google, it owns General Motors. In other words, you take those capitalist owners of those companies and you give it to the people's representative, the government. That's a socialist country. I'm really butchering this, but you get the idea, okay? Communism goes one step further, does away with the government. It's just common ownership and the good-heartedness of the workers, and we all share and share alike. This is why every teenager goes through a phase where they go, why don't we just do communism? And it sounds great. And it sounded great when Marx pitched it. You think to yourself, because you're looking back, you're saying, Terry, check this here. Communism didn't work out that way. I know, hold that thought. But on the front end of it, when Marx is looking at it, what he's saying is, we're just all going to share. If I have, we'll each get what the basic idea is from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. Share and share alike, okay? Well, let's talk about communism. Communism was a disastrous failure. That's not an opinion because there is no communism in the world anymore. It failed to the tune of tens of millions of people starving to death in China and in Russia, Soviet Union. It also failed in the sense that as you get into the socialist part and you want to move on, the people who are in charge of the government, a la Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, whatever, decide, well, I don't know about this whole share and share alike thing. My life is pretty good, right? Turns out maybe all people aren't so nice inside. Refer to the Christian story, fallen humanity. Bottom line is it didn't work. It was a massive failure in the 20th century. So what you have left are some various kinds of socialist countries. Okay, that was a long-winded way to get to Scandinavia. Scandinavian countries are not actually socialist countries. Scandinavian countries, and there are several of them, so I'm going to paint with a broad brush here, but every one of them has a market system. That is capitalistic with a big social safety net. So think about a market-based system that's not socialist with a big social security and welfare system underneath it, okay? That's what makes it look more socialist. So they're not really true socialist countries. They're also very different because they're teeny. I mean, what you could do forget whether it's socialist or whatever, you could ask, why don't we do what Sweden's doing? And you go, that would be nice if we had about, 5% of the people that we have, right? But it doesn't work with this many people. It's never been transferred very well. So I'm not so much talking against it as I'm saying we got to be realistic here. If you're advocating socialism and you're pointing at Scandinavian countries, you've got some major work to do. First, you've got to show that whatever it is they're doing is transferable and will work in a bigger country. And that's not a given, a la Argentina. Second thing you have, because that's a massive failure. Second thing you have to do is you have to realize there's a free market at the center of those. They're not really socialist. And then we might have a discussion about how we ought to organize things. So, good question. My contention in a nutshell is those are not actually socialist countries, but I'm not trying to quibble. If you think we should be organized like Sweden, Denmark, Finland, etc., you really need to make the argument of talk to me exactly how that's going to work in a country that's way bigger, because it hasn't. Good question.
This goes back to your recap of the Christian perspective. It just seems like a question we should answer. What is reconciliation with God?
Yes, okay, let's go. I kept that at kind of a high level. Here's the gospel. This is the good news. This is the story, the actual historical event that happened. This is Romans chapter 1 through chapter 6, which I urge you to read. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And because we are rebels to God, we stand under condemnation. We are doomed, just like any prisoner of war, just like anybody who's rebelled against their Creator. We are under the condemnation of God because of our sin. There is nothing we can do to pay that debt, to make that right. And I'm just using the word reconcile. But what I really mean is we cannot pay that debt. We cannot make this right. So God, because He loved us, sent His Son Jesus to pay the debt that you and I could not pay. And so He died for our sins. He was raised from the dead. And we too can live in newness of life. He paid the price for our transgressions so that we can be reconciled to God and, by implication, to one another. The gospel's about more than just me going to heaven, okay? And to one another. What do I need to do? Place your trust in Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, His unique Son, so that all who trust in Him might never perish but have eternal life. And so that is the gospel story. That's really what reconciliation, I just wrapped it all up in that one word for the story, but that's the good news of the gospel. Read the Gospel of John. It makes it so perfectly clear what's happening, and you'll see that story playing itself out. Great question. Well, in this lesson, we want to move on. So we talked about the Christian story, the Marxist story, or what I'm going to call the Marxist story. You'll hear the term cultural Marxism a lot. That's the story that's referring to. I want to go talk about the story of Moses, and so the story of the Jews. So let me take you back in history just a little bit. And so we're going back to, let me turn this on so I can write a little bit. So we're going to go back to 2000 BC. 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, there is a world in which fallen humanity lives. Okay? So we have sinful people in rebellion to God, and God calls an individual. His name was Abraham, as it comes down to us, and He says, Abraham, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to give you a land for all your descendants, and I'm going to bless the whole world through you. This is the beginning of God's plan of redemption, reconciliation, if you will. And so Abraham believed God, and sure enough, God said, go to this land that I will show you. And he goes to the land of Canaan, which is the land of Israel. It is the state of Israel today, basically. So we'll keep our terminology the same. And so Abraham was faithful to God. So here's one man who's following God in the midst of a whole world who is not. And so God says, you're going to have a child, and through him, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And through this nation, I'm going to editorialize, through this nation, I'm going to bring about the Messiah who's going to pay the price for all of these people because I want them all to be reconciled to me. And so Abraham says, okay, so Abraham goes to Canaan, and this is where the story gets so human, and it's beautiful because it's human. This is not a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a man named Abraham, and he loved God, and he did what God wanted, and everybody lived happily ever after. Yeah, well, not so much. In the sense that Abraham gets there, he's got no children. He says, wow, this isn't going well. Maybe I should have a child with the maid. And his wife says, yeah, because that's a custom of the time, right? And so, and this is a very normal thing. So they have a child, and his name is Ishmael. God hears. And God comes and says, Abraham, that was not good. He said, I told you you're going to have a son, so you're going to have a son. And sure enough, 13 years later, his wife, Sarah, has a son named Isaac. And here's what their family tree looks like. There were no counselors before this, but I believe this is when psychologists came into being, okay? Because this is like your first really dysfunctional family. So Isaac is the child that God said he would have. And Abraham, being a human being, did human being things and kind of messed things up a little bit. And so Ishmael was his older son, but Isaac is the child of promise. These two kids, this is a brilliant story. I don't have time to go into the story. I'm just tracing the history. So pardon me for not talking about all the really interesting stuff. But basically, Isaac is going to be the father of the Jews. Ishmael is going to have 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Arabia. This is in the book of Genesis in your Old Testament. And so he is the father of the Arabic people, okay? So you get two groups of people come from this. Muhammad traces his lineage through Ishmael back to Abraham. We will talk about Muhammad in our next lesson. So Isaac, through his lineage, you get Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These are the kids. Jacob has a name, Israel. He has another name. His name is Israel. And he has 12 sons. They become 12 tribes. They're the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, like literally, family gathering, 12 tribes of Israel coming over for Thanksgiving. I mean, this is the 12 tribes of Israel. And so you have Abraham then is the first Jew in the sense that he is the father of the people of promise, the Jews. In other words, he promised Abraham, you're going to have a bunch of descendants, you're going to have a land that I'm going to give to you. These are the people of promise that were promised to Abraham, and they came through Isaac, Jacob, etc. And then down the road, you have Moses, David, Mary, and Joseph and Jesus. So does that make sense? That split is going to cause just unending trouble. But for now, let's just stay in the right-hand quadrant and let's follow the history of the Jews. So you may remember that Abraham demonstrates his faith by being willing to sacrifice Isaac. One of the really hard stories in the Bible, very, very famous. And in the Bible, he is prepared to sacrifice Isaac. God sends the angel and says, you've demonstrated your faith. I'm going to bless you through Isaac. In the Quran, that's Ishmael. So in the Quran, that same story is there. And I'll quote a bunch of stuff out of the Quran next week so you can see, because I want you to get into this story from the view of the people that see it. So we're going to be Jews tonight. And so you have Isaac. And then what happens? So it's about 1800 BC. There are about 70 in this family. And there's a famine in the land of Israel. And so they go to Egypt. They go to Egypt and they live right up here in this part of Egypt. They've come from Canaan, by the way, or Canaan is just another word for modern day Israel. And so they spend 400 years there and they become slaves. God hears his people and they go, God, you promised, this land, but here we are in Egypt, we're slaves. And he's like, how did you get to Egypt? Well, we actually came here willingly. Why didn't you go back? Well, it was kind of nice here. They've got great soccer leagues and good interstates and things like that. And we just decided we didn't want to go back. He goes, so it's your fault. Yes, it's our fault, but please save us. And he says, okay, I will. He said, I'll be faithful to you, even though you haven't been faithful to me. And he sends Moses, right, to rescue them, and Moses does. And that is the book of Exodus, and it's well worth the read. I mean, it's unbelievably interesting. And so Moses leads the Israelites, now several million strong, out of Egypt, and he's going to take them back to where God told them, to the land of Israel, to Canaan. But on the way, they stop at Sinai. And this is the beginning of Jewish people as you and I know Jewish people. He goes up onto Mount Sinai, comes down with the law of Moses, God's law that he's given to his people. He comes down with the tablets with 10 commandments on them, but he actually comes down with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, first 5 books of your Old Testament. By the way, those are the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. In fact, your Old Testament, if you're Protestant, not so much if you're Catholic, but if you're Protestant and you're looking at a Protestant Bible, that Old Testament is exactly the Jewish Old Testament. In other words, if you have friends that are Jewish, they are reading that exact text. So Christians, Jews, and Islam recognizes that. They just read the Quran, but they recognize the Old Testament as this inspired book from God. And so he comes down with 613 commandments, 10 of them on the stone, 613 commandments, and said, you are God's chosen people. You're the children of Abraham of promise, and God is going to take you where he promised that he would take you. And so he does. He takes them back to Canaan. It takes 40 years in the desert. That's a great story in and of itself. See our Exodus series if you want to talk about that. But basically, he unifies the people around this covenant, this contract between God and the people. The people, remember, are still under a death sentence of sin, like you and I were. And he says, very well, I'm going to give you this law, and I'm going to choose you as a people, and by obeying these laws, obeying these rules, you will become holy. You'll become separated. And all the other nations in the world, you become a royal priesthood. You become a light to all the other people in the world. God's using the Jews, right, to wake up the whole world. And he says, you're going to be special by your conduct, by following these laws, and you are going to be an example and a light to draw the whole world back to me. And so that's their mission. So Moses unifies them. And so in 1400 BC, that's a traditional date for Moses and the Exodus, 1400 years before Christ, the Jews get the law of Moses. Okay? So that's their historical story. This is the fundamental confession of the Jewish faith. And it's in Deuteronomy. It's in those 5 books of Moses. This is what Moses spoke to them and said, God said this, and he says this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, monotheism. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. This little confession is called the Shema. It's got a name. And Shema just means hear. It's just the first word in Hebrew. So, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And all of these commands. So now, what I want to do is, now you know where the Jewish people came from, what their lineage is, and how they are chosen and set apart through this covenant with God. This is all part of the Jewish story, and I'm going to summarize it at the end. Okay, so I want to bring this into modern times, and I want to start showing you how Jews today, and since 1400 BC, basically, have implemented this Shema. So, for example, write them on the door frames of your houses and your gate. These are examples of things called a mezuzah. A mezuzah is just a little container, and they're all kinds. Some of these are very old. The 2 on the right are really old. The 3 in the middle are very modern, and the one on the left is like, I don't know, kind of ultra contemporary or something. But basically, they're just little containers, and guess what's in them? Rolled up on some paper is the Shema written down, right? As a representative of, we heard you and we are obeying. We are putting the law, this covenant, on the door frames of our houses. It's put on the right side of all the, well, depends on which sect of the Jews that you are, and we're going to go through it. But theoretically, on the right door frame of all the doors in your house. typically with most Jewish people that you and I would come in contact with in America are Reform Jews, usually the front door. So you will see these. You go to Israel, you see them all over the place. This is a way of basically keeping that commandment. This is a young Jewish boy. He's a Hasidic boy, and I'll tell you what that is in a few minutes too. But you notice the peyot, the long sideburns. In the law of Moses in Leviticus, it talks about not to trim the hair on the sides of your head. Not all Orthodox Jews read this the same way, but that's a great example of trying to follow one of those 613 laws in the law of Moses. You see this little box? I should have done a better job of this. But that little box on his forehead contains, guess what? A scroll inside that has the Shema on it and some other stuff. Because when he said, remember, bind it on your hand and bind it on your forehead. So Orthodox Jews, several times a day, this is, by the way, at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, they will bind this on their head and then they will strap on a box that goes on their hand and they will begin to daven. They'll bow like this and you'll be saying prayers. And if you can do it at the Western Wall, that's really buku good, right? That's extra credit. So you will see Jews do this, everywhere. And so that is living out that requirement. So what I'm describing to you right now is Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism looks the most like what you read in the Old Testament. Some more Orthodox Jews. This is a prayer shawl. The prayer shawl is called a talit, T-A-L-L-I-T, and the importance of it, also one of the commandments, is to wear a prayer shawl when you're praying. But actually the commandment is about the little tassels. They're called tzitzit in Hebrew, those little tassels. And you're supposed to wear tassels on your garment. And so they put them on the prayer shawl, and then they will pray in the morning prayers with the little tassels. The tassels have knots in them. Anybody want to guess how many knots in those tassels? Yes, 613, one for every commandment. And so it's a way, and so I'm not trying to be funny, I'm just telling you, it is a way of trying to obey those laws and keep this covenant. So these are examples that you're pretty familiar with today. Orthodox Jews have a distinctive look. I mean, even when you go to Jerusalem, you can see who the Orthodox Jews are because they dress differently. They dress a little differently from each other, but they all dress differently, from your average secular person, right? And they do that because in the Middle Ages, especially 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, up until the Enlightenment, AD, I'm talking about just just yesterday, My kids think I was alive during the 1700s, So 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, Jews, especially in Europe, lived in enclaves where they lived together to keep their identity. There was also some discrimination against Jews, and so they lived together, and there were rabbis in each of these places. And these Jews today still dress like their rabbis dressed. So there's a chief rabbi of every group of Orthodox Jews, and they dress like that rabbi. Some of those rabbis came from Russia, and consequently, they wear different things. This is the different hats. You can tell this is the different hats. Their pants are different too. You just can't tell it. Here's a guy whose rabbi was from somewhere cold originally, back in the 1700s, 1800s. So Orthodox dress is very traditional dress because it reflects their group that they're part of. They're all Orthodox Jews, but they belong to people that came from a certain place and still live in a lot of those places today. This is one of those rabbis. Chaim Rabinovitz is one of the rabbi guys. He's the older guy in the middle. And you'll notice everybody's dressed like him. And that's the tradition that gets carried on. Orthodox Judaism traces its lineage all the way back to Moses, basically, in the sense that we, Orthodox Jews, are trying to keep the 613 laws and commandments. And that's what you probably most think of when you think of Jews today. So let's talk about the major forms of Judaism today. So we have Orthodox Judaism, which is the most conservative. And of these, I know I'm telling you a lot of data, but I'm thinking you probably heard some of these words, and we might as well tell you now what they are. So you've probably heard of Haredi Jews. They are also known, although they don't like this word, ultra-Orthodox. Haredi Jews are theologically the most conservative of Jews. They believe that their lineage goes directly back to Moses. They are obeying the law just like Moses obeyed the law. And so they see themselves as having an unbroken strand. Other groups of Orthodox Judaism are called Hasidic, Hasids, or Hasidic Judaism. These are both Orthodox, and you won't be able to obviously tell the difference a lot of times, but these are Orthodox Jews, and Hasidic Jews basically also keep the 613 commandments. The difference is, and this might sound disparaging, and I don't mean it that way, I'm just trying to explain it to you. Think of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, kind of in the Christian world like Amish people, in the sense that, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean they live by themselves and they follow really strict rules. Think of the Orthodox Jews as serious Christians who go out and do a bunch of evangelism. Okay, so Hasidic Jews are Orthodox, but Hasidic Jews are more open to interacting with society. So does that make sense? This is kind of a side note, but I thought as long as we're here, you probably will see these words. Now you understand that's kind of the nature of Orthodox Judaism. Let me switch to Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism started in 1809 AD, just literally yesterday as history goes, in Germany. And what it was is, having gone through all the Middle Ages, having gone through a lot of persecution, having been Orthodox Jews for a while, technology kicks into gear and things get to be different. And so there's certain groups of Jews that thought, we need to adapt our Jewish beliefs, we need to adapt the law of Moses to the modern world. So needless to say, these are the two ends of the religious spectrum: Orthodox, Reform. Reform Jews, for example, don't require women and men to sit on separate sides of the synagogue. They do bat mitzvahs for girls, just like Orthodox do bar mitzvahs for boys. Reform Jews don't observe, is not required to observe any of the dietary. You can have a cheeseburger if you want to. Orthodox Jew wouldn't be caught dead with a cheeseburger. But you can have a cheeseburger if you want to. There's no particular dietary restrictions. There are no restrictions on the Sabbath. Orthodox Jews will not travel on the Sabbath, on Saturday. Well, sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And in Oklahoma City, there are very few Orthodox Jews. Go to New York City, Chicago, bigger cities will have communities, and they will walk to synagogue on Saturday, and they will only walk so far. Okay? Reform Jews don't think that those rules are necessary, and so they've adapted those rules quite a bit. So Reform Judaism, if you want to think about it in this way, and again, I'm not trying to be critical, I'm just trying to relate it to our world, they would be very liberal Christians, right? Very liberal in the sense that they don't think you need to follow all 613 laws. They have a very different view of the Bible. They have a very different view of the inspiration of the Bible. So it's very different groups. They have ethnicity in common, but they don't really have a lot in common in terms of their religious practice. Conservative Jews come about in the late 1800s because they said, if those are my two choices, wow. You know, I really don't want to be Orthodox. I want to participate in the modern world, but I just really don't want to go all the way to where the Reform people did. So conservative Judaism is kind of a blend in the middle. So for example, conservative Judaism does have some dietary restrictions. They don't follow all the dietary restrictions. They will not marry. Their rabbis won't marry a Jew to a non-Jew. Reform Jews will, Orthodox won't, conservative won't. Conservative is just kind of what it says, a little bit more conservative. They do keep circumcision. They do think you need to wear the prayer shawl. None of these things Reform think are essential, although many may do it. Have the prayer shawl. They only do bar mitzvahs. They don't do bat mitzvahs. So conservative Judaism is kind of in the middle. So in America, the majority of Jewish people living in America are Reform Jews, then conservative Jews, then Orthodox Jews in terms of numbers, okay? So in Oklahoma City, for example, there are most of the people who are Jewish in Oklahoma City would be Reform Jews, some conservative. We have a synagogue and a temple for both of those different denominations or sects or groups. We have a very small community of Orthodox Jews in Oklahoma City. We're not a big city. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea. And then there is such a thing as secular Judaism, and that is ethnic Judaism without any of the typical Jewish religious beliefs. In other words, you can be atheist and be Jewish. You can't be atheist and be Orthodox Jews. You can't be atheist and be conservative Jew. You can be atheist and be a Reform Jew, but you can also just be a non-practicing Jew. Like, I'm Jewish by identity, but I don't practice. Interesting thing there. Jews have always considered someone to be Jewish if their mother was Jewish. Why? Well, there are sometimes questions about dad, but never about mom. Okay? So Orthodox Jews say Jews are Jews if your mother is a Jew. Conservative Jews say you're a Jew if your mother's a Jew. Reform Jews, if your mom or your dad or you converted. That's fine with us. Secular Jews say, I'm ethnically Jewish. Do my DNA test. You'll see some percentage of ethnic Judaism in there, but I'm not religious. Okay? So those are kind of the four groups. You go to Israel, you'll see all of those groups there in a big mix. Question?
This is the first reference I've heard that Moses received the Pentateuch and not just the Ten Commandments. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, according to Moses receiving the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, those are synonymous, kind of. I mean, basically. So Pentateuch is a Greek word that means 5 books. Torah is the law of Moses, the teaching of Moses, and that is embodied in the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so all of those books have some commands in them. And according to tradition, Jewish tradition, Moses wrote those down. Not everyone believes that that is true or is possible, that Moses himself wrote it down. But in the spirit of the question, those 5 books constitute the Torah. They constitute what is known as the law of Moses. When Jesus speaks about, in the New Testament, he says, have you not read the law and the prophets? He means the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, and the rest of it, of the Old Testament, which is called the prophets. So those 5 books are considered to be the law of Moses, considered to be the Torah. So yes, he got more than the 10 Commandments. He got all 613.
Okay, a couple of forms of Judaism that people would like to have you put into a category: Messianic Jews and Chabad Jews.
Yes, Chabad's easy. They're right here. Chabad is a sect, a group, and I don't mean, I'm not trying to use any of these words negatively. When I say sect, I don't mean like a cult or something. I just mean this is a group of Hasidic Jews founded in about 1700, oops, I'm off the edge of the page, 1700 AD by a guy called, this is his nickname, the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good hand. He was a Polish Jew born in the Ukraine in 1700 AD, and he began a chain of rabbis that has become the Chabad movement. So they are Orthodox Jews, they are Hasidic Jews in that line. And I'm simplifying this. There's more to the Orthodox Jews than what I've shown you. These are words I just thought you might have heard. Hasidic Jews, Haredi Jews, and I just, because if you're watching Netflix, I got a special on about Haredi Jews right now. So I just want you to know, I take my material from Netflix. So I thought you might want to know those 2 words. So Chabad is Orthodox Jews. Messianic Jews are Christians, but they were Jewish before they made the fundamental confession. The fundamental confession of Judaism is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one." Fundamental confession of Christianity: Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. There's one God, his Son Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Messiah and Christ are the same word. Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. Sorry, I'm skipping around, but I want to make sure we connect this and terminology doesn't get in our way. So a Messianic Jew is someone who was Jewish of whatever variety, who said, you know what, I am persuaded Jesus is the Messiah that was promised in the Old Testament. He is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. They are Christians. They still keep a lot of their cultural customs, but they do not place their trust in keeping the law of Moses for their salvation. They're Christians. So hopefully that clears that up.
What about all of the extra oral rules in the Talmud? Do the Orthodox follow them as well?
This is a really smart audience. You guys are good. Okay, so this is fascinating. I'll try to make it quick. Remember I told you Moses went up on the mountain, 1400 BC, comes down with the tablets. Charlton Heston breaks them, goes back up, gets another set of tablets, okay? But he's got 613 laws. That's called the Torah, the written law. According to Jewish custom, we are now outside the Old Testament. Everything I'm about to tell you now is not in the Old Testament, okay? So not everybody believes this to be true. But according to Jewish tradition and Orthodox Jewish belief, God also gave him a bunch of oral laws, oral commandments that were not written down in addition to the written law. This was transmitted rabbi to rabbi, from Aaron to the next rabbi, down through the generations, this oral law. So for you who are Christians listening to this, let me put this in perspective. When Jesus had trouble with the Pharisees, okay, fast forward 1,400 years, oral law, they memorized this. I wish I'd brought the Mishnah with me. The Mishnah is the oral law, okay, M-I-S-H-N-A-H. It's huge. And so the rabbis would argue about it, they'd write down and they would comment on it, but you've got this oral tradition. That's where all the stuff that Jesus had heartburn with the Pharisees about. Remember when the Pharisees said you can't heal on the Sabbath? That's in the oral law. That's not in your Old Testament. They said, well, you can't, help a man get up off his pallet and walk on the Sabbath. Can't do that. And Jesus said, well, you can take your animal out of the ditch on the Sabbath. This is all in the realm of the oral law. Jesus didn't disobey the law of Moses, the Torah. But he did not recognize this oral law as this is not from God. So that is a Christian perspective. Orthodox Jewish perspective is this is binding. And so you have the Mishnah, which is the oral law, and then just to fill out this word, the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah, and it is a brilliant example of Jewish literature, Jewish legal reasoning. I mean, I don't want you to have a low view of Orthodox Jews. Brilliant book, the Talmud, huge, represents millennia, a couple of millennia of rabbinic reasoning and laws and putting this oral law into practice. So, long answer to that question, that's what the Mishnah is, that's what the Talmud is, it's the oral law, and yes, Orthodox Jews believe in the oral law. Reformed Jews do not. Christians do not. I mean, it is not Christian belief that that oral law was inspired by God or binding, because Jesus obviously did not consider that to be binding. Okay? So Jesus didn't really argue with the Pharisees about the law of Moses. He argued with them about all their extra commands, all those Sabbath commands, how far you can walk, what you can do, what you can't do. I mean, it got unbelievably detailed. That's all in the oral law. That's not in the Old Testament. So, good questions. So, as a group, I want to come back. This is from the Mishnah. This is in the oral law. This expresses the Jewish idea of whatever variety you are, that we are a chosen people of God. In the Mishnah, it says this: all Israel has a share in the world to come. What does that mean? Then it goes on to tell you who doesn't. Except this guy, except this guy, except this guy. But big picture, what it says is all Jews go to heaven. That's Terry's interpretation. And Jews say, we're God's chosen people. Abraham is our forefather. Therefore, we have a share in the world to come, which is a kind of a way of saying go to heaven. Okay, so Jews have an identity, just in general, of being God's chosen people. That's part of the fundamental story. So let's talk about this story. They agree with Christians in this sense. God created us in his image. We are unique and valuable as individuals. As you would expect, it's exactly the same, because we both believe that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, however you want to say it, is inspired by God. not the oral law, but the Old Testament that we have is inspired. Humanity rebelled against God. They believe in fallen humanity, believe in sin, believe in us being under the judgment of God. We all agree. This is where the story twists a little, and we agree with this too, though. Abraham, God called Abraham, he believed God and was credited with righteousness. In other words, God chose Abraham for a special purpose with a special people. We also agree with that historically. God chose for himself descendants of Abraham, the 12 tribes of Israel, that's a historical fact, to be holy, and by holy I mean what the word really means is to be set apart, to be an example, if you will. To be holy through observance of the Torah. By keeping those 613 commandments, the world was going to go, whoa, their God, I mean, you just don't do that unless you actually really believe in your God. It's not easy to be a Jew, right? And so they're like, wow, your God's really holy. Your God's really something. And they say, yeah, our God's really real. And so come and see him. And then the Jewish people are a guide and a beacon for the world, pointing to justice and reconciliation, whether through a Messiah or a messianic age of peace. What do I mean by that? Jewish people today, in general, see themselves, first, we parted ways with Jesus. The very nature of being a Jew is not believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If you do, you're a messianic Jew, which is a Christian. Okay, but all the Jews I've talked to you about are people that don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. So who do they think they are today? I mean, who are they? They are still God's chosen people, put here to be a guide and a beacon for the world, pointing to justice and reconciliation. Jewish people are, in general, I'm painting with a broad brush, traditionally very interested in justice and peace in the world. Whether through a Messiah, Orthodox Jews believe that there will be a Messiah, they just don't think Jesus was he. Or a messianic age of peace. Reformed Jews do not believe that there will be a specific individual who's the Messiah. They believe that by doing justice and bringing the world along, being the world's teachers to be holy and just, that they will usher in an age of greater justice and peace in the world. Jews have a phrase called tikkun olam, which in Hebrew means repair of the world. This is what basically Jewish people think we're chosen by God to be part of his process of repairing the world. We believe that too. We just think it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and he really repaired the world in Jesus Christ. If you're Jewish, you don't, right? That's not part of your story. And so you're still looking to bring justice and peace and right behavior to the world so the world can live up to God's standards. Okay, so that's the basic Jewish story. Now, I thought we'd have a little more time than this, but I'm going to blitz right up to current times and tell you how the Jews today got here. But that is the Jewish story. In our next lesson, let me pause here. When we talk about Islam, Muslims, I will start to contrast and compare these two stories on the world stage and historically. And so now you understand the Jewish story. It's best understood in contrast because what's happening in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East has a lot to do with Islam intersecting with Judaism, okay? So that's next time. Now, I'd just like to bring the Jews up to the modern day. So where are the Jews? They were all over the world. How many Jews are there? Depends on how you count them. You counting moms or you counting moms and dads? There are all kinds of ways to count what it means to be Jewish. If you ask a Jew, what does it mean to be Jewish? You ask 2 Jews, you'll get 3 different answers. That's what my Jewish friends tell me. The point is, there's some argument about it, but basically, about 24 million Jews in the world. That is not a lot of people. And yet, a lot of what you see going on in the world comes from the influence of that story, that religion, that ideology, and that's why we're talking about it. So you got about 24 million. In Israel today, you have about 8 million. I'm rounding all this off. In America, you have about 7 million. And the rest are scattered all over. So Israel has about 8 million people. The Arab League, that's all these countries, have about 440 million. And they don't like each other. And that's really interesting. And so, how did that come about? So Israel, being the nation, wasn't a nation before World War II. In other words, when Israel was conquered, most recently by the Romans, right before Jesus was born, Romans conquer it. They don't have a nation of their own at that time. They don't have a nation of their own until 1947. So Jews are scattered all around the world. But you have the Holocaust in World War II, and I'm going to shorthand this. You have the Holocaust in World War II, 6 million Jews were killed. Through a variety of interesting things, which we've talked about in other series, but I won't go into it here, the United Nations establishes a nation of Israel, a place for the Jews, a Jewish homeland. In 1947, they established it. It went into effect in 1948, and a day later, 5 Arab nations invaded. This is all Israel had in 1947. There's just a little strip of land. Arab nations look at that. They're Muslim nations too, but they're Arab ethnically, and they look at that and they go, man, these dudes, there's no way they can defend this country. And so 5 Arab armies invaded. You have the Egyptians invading from the south. You have the Jordanians invading from the east. You have the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Lebanese invading from the north. Israel calls this the war for independence, and the rest of the world kind of sat by and watched, and unbelievably, against all historical odds, Israel wins. And they eke out a little country. And so they defeat all those countries. Fast forward, 1967, this is Israel, this little strip right here. Okay, this is owned by Jordan. And forget the Gaza Strip. Basically, so they're sitting there in 1967. Arab countries decide, particularly Syria and Egypt, like that was humiliating what happened in 1948. 19 years go by, build up their armies, get a bunch of arms from Soviet Russia, right? Class warfare. Russia's big into wars are good. And so they're about to attack, and Israel attacks first. Attack a day early, and it only takes 6 days for them to win this war. It's called the 6-Day War, 1967. And what did Israel conquer? They conquered the whole Sinai Peninsula. Used to be Egypt. They conquered the whole, what is now called the West Bank, that used to be Jordan. And they said, okay, next time you want to fight, let us know. And so they're hanging on to this territory. So then this brilliant Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, comes into power. He's like looking across at the Sinai Peninsula and being reminded of how humiliated the Arab world has been. And so in 1973, 6 years later, they spring a surprise war called the Yom Kippur War. Holiest day, Jewish calendar, everybody's home, and they decide to attack. And the Syrians attack through the Golan Heights, and the Egyptians attack, and it was touch and go. This is Nixon-Kissinger era. But long story short, Israelis end up winning. Russia is fueling Egypt and Syria. The U.S. is fueling Israel with equipment. And so Israel ends up winning, and they basically surround the Egyptians, and they drive the Syrians all the way back, and they stop. Because at this point, they could probably conquer Egypt and Syria, but they stop. And so Camp David Accords come along, and Israel decides, I tell you what, we'll give you back the Sinai Peninsula, and they make a peace treaty with Egypt. Brilliant move on Sadat's part, just a very good time for the world. They said, we're not really giving you back the West Bank, and we're definitely not giving you back the Golan Heights. You ever been to Israel and you're up in that area and you're out in the farmland? Golan Heights are like seriously the heights right there. I mean, the Syrians would shell them. They would have snipers shooting them. There's no way the Israeli government could give that land back. And so today, this is Israel today. So Israel, if you are an Arab, you say they're occupying the West Bank. If you're an Israeli, they're saying, we took that territory. It's our land promised to Abraham 4,000 years ago. But I will say, from having been there, in all fairness, more and more of the West Bank is under Palestinian self-government. So that's a thorny issue. We won't get into it here. But let me just put it this way. Don't believe everything you hear on television about what's going on in the West Bank. Either way. but there's more positive things going on there than you would believe. Gaza, that's Hamas. That's all you can say about Gaza. And then the Golan Heights they've kept. That is Israel today, and that is God's chosen people have a homeland today where about 8 million Jews live. And of that 8 million Jews, you have Orthodox, you have conservative, you have Reform, and you have secular Jews. And there's still the idea, and Jews are still committed to the idea of we've been chosen by God to bring about justice and peace in the world. Okay? So I know that was kind of quick bringing us up to now. That's a story I think most of you know a little bit better, the Jewish story. Next time, when I talk about the Muslim story, we'll go all the way back to Abraham and intertwine it, and we'll take the other branch. And we'll talk about what does Islam look like, because Islam has about 3 big groups like Judaism does that are really impacting world events. And then we'll look at the Middle East and you'll go, that makes perfect sense now as to why that's happening. And then I'd like to talk about the Abraham Accords and why are some of the Muslim countries making peace with Israel given this is their history. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Thank you guys very much.